None of the ideas of scaling Bitcoin itself are actually feasible. What I'm learning and what people need to admit is that what's actually happening is these layers are just protocols for coordinating trust. We all have to just accept is Bitcoin literally does not scale. There is no scale on the table. It's just gone. It's just not a thing. Stop.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions the company sponsors or projects discussed. Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian on X, here with another great episode of Supply Shock. Truly excited about this one. You're going to get to hear from someone who I consider a mentor in the space that I have said has been, or was the person I credit with orange pilling myself, which I hold in pretty high regard. So John Carvalho, CEO of Synonym, better known in the Bitcoin space, feared out there on Twitter as Bitcoin Errolog, but really someone who is building at the forefront of Bitcoin technology, doing a lot of interesting things, challenging different concepts. So I think today you're going to hear a lot of unconventional takes on topics that we discuss regularly on Supply Shock. So welcome to the podcast, John Carvalho.
Hi, Pete. Thanks for having me. Where should we start?
Yeah, let's start with Lugano, right? So I think, I know that you attend the conference every year. It's sort of within the Bitcoin conference calendar, increasingly feels like, this is where kind of the intellectual might converges on stage for interesting conversations. And there's always the selection process of, who gets selected for which panels, which debates. So you were on the Lightning panel this year, and there was a good amount of discussion around it, right? I think, we had Paul Stortz on this podcast a few weeks back catching up, and among his bugaboos is sort of, taking Lightning to task, or at least asking the technical community to sort of revisit some of their assumptions around it. And so this is at a time when, folks like Block are really pushing Bitcoin for payments at scale. Lightning is, of course, the backbone of how they're servicing and pushing this experience to users. Why don't you summarize a little bit about this debate and what you wanted to bring to that conversation for the folks at home?
I've been on a lot of Lightning panels over the past 5 years or so, and it becomes an old hat after a while. And so my only interest personally in being on them is to share things I've learned since the last time I was on them, and which means that over time my narratives and interests have become much more critical and scrutinizing what Lightning has done for us that and what it hasn't, compared to all the promises of 2018, 2019, 2020, when it was really hyped up. And in Lugano, we had another panel, and I had some of my peers there, and for the first time had Lalu, or Roast Beef, as somebody know him from Lightning Labs, on a panel. It's kind of rare, at least for me, to see that. And so I thought, oh, this will be a great chance to float some of the things I've been thinking about lately, because I've been using Lightning in production for a while as Synonym and through our own products, and it's not been, what I thought it would be. And so you mentioned Paul Stortz, Sports. He currently hates me and thinks I'm, a horrible idiot because I also want to refute drive chains. But nonetheless, we are both on a little mission under the same stars independently of trying to question the actual viability of Lightning, and in my case, scaling Bitcoin altogether. And so in that panel, I floated the idea that actually Lightning can't scale Bitcoin, and no layer can actually. And I was trying to convey, while on a panel, that there's actually math that you can use, and at least some early forms of the math have existed for years, and many people already know about it. I didn't know about it until maybe the past couple of years, and I didn't really care about it until the past year. And so now that I'm kind of like trying to figure out why nothing is going the way I thought it would, I'm kind of trying to investigate, why do people believe what I don't believe, and trying to either prove them right, or myself wrong, or myself right. And what I've come down to realize is that no, there's just no scaling there. All the scaling is actually coming from trust aspects. These layers are all credit. And so I was trying to float some of these ideas in the middle of a panel, which I think everybody wanted to be more of a casual, update on
hard
what's
to hard
happening.
to do in that kind of setting. But I was talking with Paul, and it seems like one of the things that there's a gap in, and it makes it hard for the conversation to take place, is that from a end user experience, right? Like I have a Lightning enabled wallet, right? And when I put Bitcoin in that wallet and send it to someone else, the experience feels like what I, as a regular consumer, would expect my money to behave. And it seems like there's a gap between that experience, which for this, the few people who are using it, not few dismissively, but then the grand scheme of the global things, there are, only so many people using Lightning. That experience feels good, but then there's this theoretical gap. And so I guess, was that what you experienced when you dove into it?
The experience feeling good is mostly at the cost of trust. And so in most cases, when somebody says, "Oh, Lightning works great, I use it all the time," if they're not actually like a developer or somebody who's really an enthusiast running their own node on their Umbrel or something like this, they're probably just using a custodial thing like Zaps or Wallet of Satoshi until recently. And even what they're doing with Spark could be argued is semi-custodial as well. But people think it's great and it works because when they interface with it, it mostly works. But most people don't interface with it in the ways that are required to justify its existence. In other words, you have to actually be running it yourself, holding your own keys, managing your own state, enforcing your own state. You have to be actually capable of doing that in a credible way to even justify at all the complexity. And so I think when Paul mentions that kind of thing, he's just pointing out that like most of the people have either been duped or are duping other people just by calling things Lightning that are just accounts or just totally trusted and censorable, this kind of thing. In my case, I'm going even further and saying no, like it's literally a function. There's math in there that you can just show everybody. I'm actually working on this in my as a pastime to try to actually turn this into an academic paper and show people that it's not just a crazy thing John says. It's that like if you actually take the time to model this and you can model it, you will realize that I don't know, Lightning could support something like maybe 140,000 users, like in a state of congestion, and maybe Arc could maybe handle a few million at most before things like really, really break. Like I don't just mean become unreliable; I mean totally break. And so portraying these things as scaling solutions and investing all kinds of money through VCs and all of the research that's being done is starting to feel like a big, big waste of time to me, like we're going in the wrong direction. So another goal of mine was to kind of introduce these problems so I could introduce what that means on what maybe we should think about doing next.
Yeah, one distinction you made on the panel that I thought was interesting was, and maybe I'll misspeak it or mistranslate it, but this idea of like scaling people versus scaling transactions, right? You can scale the number of sort of transactions in the system versus participants. Do you want to expand on that a little bit more? Did I get that right, or what is the heart of that distinction there, if there is one?
Well, there's a few concepts there. One would be scaling users, another would be scaling transactions, another would be scaling trust. And so none of the ideas of scaling Bitcoin itself are actually feasible, in my opinion, and in my limited academic, opinion. I guess same thing. Um,
Well, you were an experience there, right? You became sort of a self-taught in many ways as you built some of these companies, right? You don't have
Absolutely,
any.
everything I am is self-taught. I withdrew from college in my first semester, and I never went back. And everything has been jobs since then. I had no experience with anything like deeply technical before Bitcanon. I was just doing maybe websites through my marketing company, static websites, this kind of thing. A little bit of PHP programs and things like this through people that worked for me, but no, nothing even close to what is happening today. Running a company, 25 people creating, cutting edge tech. But with the users versus transactions versus trust thing, so the argument that most layer companies want to make, Lightning Labs, the art companies, et cetera, is that they can scale Bitcoin to millions of users and even beyond to a billion, say. Like they want to outdo Visa, like literally. The problem is that like there's literally no hope. Like it's so far from a billion that we'd be lucky to get to 10 million with any combination of anything and it actually even work on a day-to-day basis. And so that I could show, and I plan to soon, show this with just math and explaining how it all, goes down and what all the bounds are, everything. And I could prove that, no, you just literally cannot scale users. In other words, the amount of users that would use Bitcoin base layer and the amount that would use layer twos is going to be the same ultimately when it comes down to actually having to enforce these layers in the state and not having to use them in a totally trusted way. I won't get into it now because I'm still doing a little bit of research and thought on it, but I don't think you can scale the transactions either. I think what I'm learning and what people need to admit is that what's actually happening is these layers are just protocols for coordinating trust, for coordinating zero confirmation transactions. They're not actual scaling things. They're all of the scale that's provided is through the trust that they put you into. So if there's any efficiency gain, say for example, in a high frequency transacting, this is something that even I have up until very recently always said that Lightning will always at least be useful for business to business high frequency transacting.
Right.
The
Yeah.
problem is that's a very low quantity of need. In other words, it doesn't really matter to the average user. And you're talking about scaling to a few more hubs or something like this.
Well, I think you were speaking correctly to like, I think there's been two views for Lightning for a while. Run has been like sort of, it would be a network of, a mix of kind of large, businesses or entities and individuals as it has been, right? We sort of in 2021, 22 had this, let's rebuild the internet on top of Lightning, group that's kind of faded out. But, there's the current state of the network today, which is, it has the mix of people like Spark and there are people running nodes. And then, the sort of future state, I think a lot of people's perspective, expected, I think you just mentioned a case that I thought was probably the most plausible, right? Is where you get a few large companies, maybe like a Spark or like a Visa, kind of doing lots of transactions. And that essentially you'd kind of see what happens with credit card providers today, right? You maybe have hundreds of thousands of users kind of using a hub, and then these hubs would coordinate with each other and settle on Bitcoin. It sounds like, so you don't even think that sort of normative expectation now is
no,
rational.
because most economic relations are not reciprocative. They're not back and forth in any sort of equal flow. And that's what you need to get the high frequency efficiency, right? Where we can take what would have been 100 transactions and now it's only one or two. That's scaling transactions at least, right? But in most cases where you would do that, it's with somebody that you also have some trust with. And so what you're really leveraging is just that if something goes wrong, no matter what, they're probably going to help make it right because you have this, high frequency relationship with them. And in the past, imagine we never invented a Lightning Network. We could have just used like traditional state channels, like one of the primitives of Lightning Network, and say, Binance and Bitfinex have a state channel together, and they're just trusting each other to manage that channel together. And that's it. There's no network. And then say if Binance does that also with Kraken, all of a sudden now you have a network, right?
I was like early Liquid was sort of aspiring to be something like that, if I remember correctly.
Well, Liquid is different in that it's a totally separate logical blockchain. So it's really much more like an altcoin, or it's a totally separate thing. Yes, it's made within a federation, but the federation actually places miners in that case.
I just remember they really were focused on solving sort of like inter-exchange, relationships there.
Yeah, originally that was a narrative, that people would do this for arbitrage. And I was even arguing with them about like Liquid from day one on that as well, because when you give everybody equal arbitrage opportunity, the arbitrage goes away, right? So there is no actual efficiency there. You're just kind of taking out the cream, and now everybody's competing again. Anyway, the point being that the scaling of transactions through state channels would have happened inevitably without a Lightning Network movement. And so the movement is more related to the routing feature, right? And now it has developed to not only is Lightning going to scale Bitcoin and have, bajillions of users, but it's also going to be the rails for the next layer twos, which will be Arc and Spark and these things. And that's even worse because people think of this as, oh, well, each of those things spread load. You know what I mean? Like the amount of load on the system that is required, if we have more subsystems, we can spread more load. But that's not how it works at all because the base layer doesn't change at all, no matter how many subsystems you put on it. So they all end up having the same on-chain limit. And because all of these layers work by starting with some form of a trusted multisig, that means that the layer in the protocol is actually designed to help you avoid somebody stealing your Bitcoin from within that multisig. And they each differ in how they do this. Like Lightning has, all the different states, and you can do a punishment transaction if somebody tries to steal from you. Arc has other methods, and Spark has other. They all claim capability of unilateral exit, but that only will work when you don't need it. Basically, it's like a parachute you can only use in clear skies. And when when your plane is crashing or another plane is about to crash into you, there won't be an opportunity for you to jump out because the blocks will be full or the on-chain fees will be too expensive just because of math boundaries. Just nothing to do with me trying to predict the future so much as here's what will happen if you put these numbers into the variables.
We talked about like the definition of user for layer one, right? I think you look at the early period of Bitcoin as, there was a lot of consternation about this, but eventually there was, you run a node and therefore you are sort of a member of the network. And if you're transacting, running an economic node, you're part of the Bitcoin network. What are your current thoughts on the layer two definition? So you're saying it sounds like it's impossible to bring that relationship up to these other levels, however many you were to stack on top of Bitcoin. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Sure. Yeah. I'm saying that all of them are limited by the base layer. So the only way you're going to increase the actual, maximum load of the whole network, anything attached to Bitcoin, is basically by changing Bitcoin itself, making the blocks bigger, some sort of new invention that makes layers somehow, easier to enforce or scale beyond a few million users. You need some really fundamental change that nobody is actually proposing. Even the proposals that have not been approved yet, like CTV and things like this, they don't solve this problem either. They might move the numbers around, fudge the numbers a little bit, but you're not going to get orders of magnitude difference.
I think I was trying to get at is, we have a defined relationship with the user now in the Bitcoin protocol. And then the claim for a while was that Lightning is Bitcoin, right? This was sort of the normative claim, is that Lightning was distinct among Bitcoin L2s and that it was an extension of Bitcoin. And you saw this kind of come up around when there was new challenger L2s and bridges, or just the idea that something like
it's just not. It's credit. It's not Bitcoin. It's credit. And the reason why is because you don't know that it's Bitcoin until you can confirm that unilateral exit or that credible exit, that enforcement transaction, whatever you need to do to get off that layer without somebody else's cooperation. In order to do that, you have to be able to afford your own UTXO at whatever price. And so you can imagine that as Bitcoin becomes used by more people, the base fee will rise, and it will stay there. You could say, what if blocks are almost full all the time? We've seen how Bitcoin can hold transaction fee of $5, $10, $20, even for a little while. If it holds that for a longer term, that excludes all users of layers below that amount. And so if you have a $20 Lightning transaction, $20 Lightning channel, we are $20 balance, and the on-chain fee is $10, you have no economic rationale to close that channel, right? Like you have no economic reason to even enforce it because it would cost you, half as much as what it's worth. And in some cases, just as much as what it's worth. And so what you're really looking at is a situation where when the network requires scale, it also requires trust. And so no matter what you do, what you call a user has to be somebody who probably both has an on-chain UTXO that only they hold and has the ability to pay for UTXO to exit any layer two. The reason I mention both is because in many cases, when you leave a layer, you have to do a sweep transaction as well. Or in some cases where you want to defend from attack, you have to be able to do like a mutual burn where you end up disincentivizing the attacker by spending all the fees to the miner. And so there's just all these weird dynamics and limits that just make it honestly quite pointless. You might be able to create some environments that are useful. Like, for example, I know that Arc is trying to go beyond scaling. They're trying to say this is an environment where you can do other things, like DeFi things and things like this. But it will still all be at the benefit or, because there's trust being leveraged. It won't be because we've solved some sort of scaling. It's just we have to accept Bitcoin does not scale. If it did scale, it wouldn't work. The reason it works is because it doesn't scale. If you want more scale, you either need more Bitcoins, like more blockchains, or to make Bitcoin itself bigger blocks, etc. And even those have limits, right? You make bigger blocks. Now you have eventually a scaling limit you're going to hit where you exclude people on the cost of running a node. Now we could quibble about whether running a node makes you a user or not. I would be more lenient there. I would say as long as you actually hold the UTXO, the keys for it, you're probably good enough as to be called a user. You're just not someone who's actually affecting the current protocol, but you still have a claim, a valid claim, and you can afford to enforce that claim, so you're fine. But yeah, I think that um, an economic node is a bit of a heavy concept too that most people can't fully understand. I think it just means you are somebody that enforces the protocol by receiving a transaction. That's all it really means is you're somebody who receives transactions, now. And if you stop, you have no opportunity to enforce anything, right? The enforcement happens subjectively. It's when you decide to actually accept Bitcoin as a form of settlement.
Maybe let's stick with the credit idea and kind of abstract it a little bit for the folks following along, because it's been very overused recently, especially in the context of these Bitcoin treasury companies and sort of the digital credit instruments from Michael Saylor and folks like that. So when you're saying credit, it sounds like what you're saying is that, credit is something that, it's a relationship of trust ultimately that people will settle later. And that this is just sort of an encompassing term that you feel comfortable now sort of describing even Lightning transactions as being a form of credit. Maybe just expand there a bit.
Sure. I would say we could abstract it even a little further first and just change credit to trust and say, okay, if we had to explicitly express trust in a digital, realm and a network, et cetera, what would be the actual parameters? What would you fill in to actually make sure that trust was being used and that was used in the way that you chose? Well, it would be defining who you trust, defining what you trust them with, defining how much, and then defining any terms around that, which could just be in its most basic form, a length of time for how long, right? So who, what, how much, how long? It's just 4 questions you have to answer. And so once you can see how those 4 questions are the same exact questions you have to answer for credit, right?
Do you think that a multi-sig collaborative setup also kind of falls under that definition? Like, I'm just thinking multiple stakeholders, there's coordinating, or is that...
If people can take the money without your cooperation, it's trusted, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on the multi-sig, for example. Like if the multi-sig requires, 2 of 3 and you are 2 of the 3, then there's no trust, right? It's just
Okay.
some sort of backup situation or something like this, right? But if it's a 2 of 3 where 2 other people have 2 of it, then now you have to trust them not to collaborate, right? So now you've entered a game, and this is the problem: is that most of these things that provide scaling are just games that are playing with trust. Some of them are relatively stable, but they're only going to be that way while Bitcoin isn't at scale. In other words, isn't full. And so the layers will work just fine while nobody actually needs them. But when people actually need them, when Bitcoin requires scaling beyond what the base layer can hold and beyond what people are willing to pay on the base layer, then the layers will start to fail.
I think you made this point on stage in Lugano, but there's this idea that, so, and again, I'm just taking the claim that, people who make this idea that Lightning is Bitcoin would probably argue, okay, so if Lightning is Bitcoin, I'm running a Lightning node, and then I'm having these economic relationships. It sounds like you made the point that, at a certain point, you end up with that Bitcoin being passed through channels and routes that you don't have control over, and essentially that there's some lack of clarification of like who you have relationships with on the Lightning Network. Again, I'm probably doing a poor job of explaining what you're saying, but it sounded like you were sort of making the claim that Lightning is a bit ambiguous, at least like if you are a Lightning Network stakeholder, it's hard to tell who your counterparty exposure is.
I would say all complexity is ambiguous in that way, and we are, as a community, big shills of complexity as a form of scaling. And so, anytime you try to introduce complexity into the user experience, you're having to find some way to gloss it over, right? To say like, oh, well, it's not really all the things we have to explain to people. It's only this. And so, for example, in a Lightning wallet, that's self-custodial Lightning, we try to hide that they have 2 channels and how much the balance is in each channel and whether or not they need more liquidity. And so we do an automatic splicing in the back when we can, or we give them a new channel automatically when they need one. And so we mask these things. on the panel, what was discussed is how we end up piling these things together. Like you do like a lightning that does a swap into liquid that comes back through some other, breeze spark thing, etc. And there's no way you can actually communicate that to an end user where you can say, "Oh, like this is what's happening," and you're made the right choice. And their arguments are like this. They're like, well, we don't explain how, interbank settlement works and things like this. But all of their arguments, you may notice, come from a perspective of trusted services, right? Banks are trusted, credit is trusted. And then you even heard the argument on stage, I think Lalo made, where you said, well, even if they can't go on chain and enforce their channel, they could just spend it on the Lightning Network. The problem is they can't they can only do that if their counterparty lets them do it. That the counterparty has to actually cooperate with that route to allow the person to make a Lightning payment. If they don't cooperate, then your only option is to close the channel. If you can't afford to close the channel, guess what? You're in an entirely trusted state.
So let's just give an example. So, like, I'm guilty. I'm a Moon user, right? I know that Moon has some sort of MUUN, some sort of back end process where there's some sort of submarine swap. From my vantage point, when I need to pay a merchant at some conference, to support the network, it works, right? We settle, person accepts the payment. But you're saying it's essentially, do you think there's some requirement to explain those relationships to Bitcoin end users? Or I guess what would be, because, as an end user consumer in that experience, right? I haven't noticed any harm happen to any of the parties, right? Like I bought a coffee somewhere, or I was down in, at the Lugano conference, like I bought a shirt, person accepted it. I got the shirt, we carried on with our lives. Like, where does that,
Yeah.
So it's like, where does this actually come back to us, right? Like, it's hard to imagine like what these fail states, that you're talking about would look like practically, right?
Well, I mean, whether there is an obligation to report this to your users is first a moral question, right? And so that's subjective. It's up to each individual. I don't know the answer. My answer would be yes. Other people in that panel's answer would be no, not really. So I don't know whether that, what's right and what's best, so much as that's why we end up getting regulated, is because we end up making bad decisions for our users, and then they end up paying the price for it. They end up saying, well, this isn't what I thought it was. I was rug pulled. And then the regulators come in and say, oh, there was actual loss that happened. So now we need to make sure that anybody who does this tells people that they're doing this and reports it to us, et cetera. And this is how regulations creep in. It's when we start making decisions for our users that trust us and we fail to be trustworthy. So yeah, I don't know if it's a requirement. In the case of Moon, I would say my attitude to that is maybe flipped now, where in the early days when people figured out that Moon wasn't really doing Lightning, it was a little bit scandalous and a little bit like, oh, they're lazy, they're cheating, whatever. But the truth is, what they did is much, much more simple than what a lot of other people did. And all they did was they said, okay, we're going to just admit that for some small portion of your balance, it's trusted. And we hold it for the user in Lightning for them. But whenever that reaches a certain amount, we're going to sweep it on chain for them. So the trust is always limited to an exact amount. And so as long as you are checking their code and you're happy with that relationship, it's pretty easy to communicate that. You can just say, hey, we provide a trusted balance up to $50. And every time you have $50, you're going to see a transaction into your wallet where you keep it. And that's something you can actually communicate pretty easily, right? But how do you communicate like, oh, you have free channels and right now the fees are higher than the balances within your channels, so you have no way to defend yourself if we steal the money from you or if the government tells us to steal the money from you. It's just like things get more complicated because you've now embraced all of the complexity. Whereas in Moon, what they said was, this is just a Bitcoin wallet, but we're also going to run a Lightning node for you so we can provide some, light payment processing services in small quantities. And that's all it did. And then while Satoshi took that to the next level and just said, oh, totally trusted, totally account based. And you're going to trust us for everything, no matter how high the balance. And then they ended up providing the best user experience because of that. They somehow were able to do it, without getting regulated. They have now tried to convert to a more semi-custodial thing with Spark. But in the end, they succeeded wildly just by faking Lightning, right? And so it's like is Lightning actually something the whole world is actually using and needing, or is it just like there's a really dedicated group of Bitcoiners that will support anything that meets the narratives, and if you hit the right, if you sing the right song, you'll get that group to use your stuff. It has nothing to do with whether that group needs your stuff. It's just, that they want everything that fits the right checkpoints.
So what would be your appeal to the folks in the development community or just the, intellectual Bitcoiners out there who are, sort of, their mental model, includes the Lightning Network? I guess, how do you want the community to adjust? I mean, obviously I know with Synonym, we spoke around the launch and you were pretty clear that, you saw digital credit as being broadly something that was very interesting and that would help with scaling. But I guess, what's the appeal to the folks who are in the Lightning bubble? How do you want them to respond, adapt? What do you think let's just say Lightning continues, what's lost?
I have done just as much research as many of them have, but I don't come from the same culture or background as them. And what I see is that my efforts to, be a part of this and embrace it have not gone the way I wanted. And I would ask them if they at least somewhat agree. In other words, that Lightning hasn't quite, achieved what they hoped it would by now, that it wasn't quite as easy. It was even more difficult than they thought, and that we just aren't making the progress that we had hoped by now, and that its relevance within the entire Bitcoin movement has kind of become, barely growing, right? And so I would ask them, first to ask themselves that would they agree with all of that, and then start to ask themselves how much of that they think is just because of a complexity fetish. In other words, we see that a lot of developers that want to be the one to develop the next layer, the next soft fork, the next guy to be a mini Satoshi, and all of that comes through the lens of I have a lot of complexity I want to add to Bitcoin. I have a lot of complexity I want to put in users' hands, and that's the solution. And complexity is kind of like it's like a simulation. It's like when you ask an AI to something and it's an agreeable AI. It will just keep letting you go and go and go into a deep, infinite rabbit hole, and it will just keep piling on the complexity and just keep supporting you. And that's what the community is becoming. It's becoming like this. Oh well, we have this simulation, and in the simulation, anything is possible. So all complexity is interesting. But the problem is that it is a simulation, and that means that I can take the rules of it and show how the rules of it are actually totally incompatible with the base layer in physics. And so if you think about all these things and you ask yourself, well, maybe you've been working in Lightning for like 6 years, 7 years, this individual, would you prefer that you could now spend the next 6 or 7 years doing the same thing again and keep trying, or taking a new direction that actually like is more physics compatible, more reality compatible, and could really have like potential for helping Bitcoin and anything scale to whatever amount they could imagine through trust and coordination in a peer-to-peer layer. Because that's ultimately what each layer is. The benefit of each layer is providing some sort of paradigm where people can effectively trust each other and then coordinating payments within that layer. And the truth is, if all you want to do is coordinate peers and batch behaviors and things like this, you just don't need all this complexity, or you certainly don't need it to be complexity that is derivative of Bitcoin. It could just be complexity for the sake of allowing people to explicitly express trust to each other, whether it be in the abstract through reputation, web of trust, or more specific through amounts of credit that use those four parameters. The who, the what, how much, and how long. That to me seems like a more promising primitive to say, okay, I can't. Who can argue with that? Who can say, "Oh, that doesn't sound interesting"? That if we can figure out a way to get each individual peer to express those four qualities in all interactions, intentionally or passively, then they can do that for Bitcoin. They can do it for bananas. They can do it for coin joins. They can do it for marketplaces. They can do it for social media. They can do it for anything, and they can be the users are in control of the coordination instead of a hub. And so everything we do at Synonym is trying to allow for scale, but default to a peer-to-peer mode. And so we're just trying to say the user is always ultimately in control, and the middlemen are like commoditized. And that's what we try to do with all of our designs. And I think this can also be done with scaling payments.
You've deployed a few things so far, right? You've got, I believe, the social network around Synonym is live, or at least in beta. What have you, since you've kind of put this idea forward, what have you built? What are you excited about? What's working?
So I would reject the social media term. Granted, that is a use case of a network, right? And of a website that portrays the data in a network. But if you think about it, like what isn't social media now? You know what I mean? Like you have YouTube and you can leave comments. You can leave thumbs up and ratings. You have the same thing in every, marketplace platform where there's, reviews and things like this. You have all many flavors of social. Now social's mixing in with search. AI is mixing in with everything. It's all just becoming one jumbled thing that is just people trying to do things with other people, which is what networks are for. So is a network social media? I don't know. But what we have made, sorry for the little rant there, but um, what we have made is a new web platform, a new protocol for using keys as entities. And the keys ultimately are used as the same way you would use a website domain. And so instead of having, pete.com, petewizard.com or such, you have a public key that can actually be looked up and resolved to any endpoint, any file, data, website, server, doesn't matter. And so the way this works is we put a signed DNS record into mainline DHT. Mainline DHT is the largest, oldest, most decentralized network on the planet by orders of magnitude. There's nothing even close to the amount of people that use it and support it and had been doing so. It is the same network that powers and coordinates torrents like BitTorrent, and people downloading movies and software and stuff. And it's been around as long as that's been around. It supports this capability of putting a small amount of data in the nodes. And so we use mainline DHT nodes to store your DNS record that's signed by your key. And this gives you power over any server, right? Imagine now, oh, I point my DNS, my website, to a Google server, and now Google censors you. Well, all you have to do is update your DNS to point to a new server where your data is. It can be one hosted by you or one hosted by Amazon. It doesn't matter. Or it can be, hosted at X, or, it can be your Twitter profile. Whatever it may be, you're in control of where it lives. And anybody who knows your key can always find out the current location, no matter what happens to you. So you can reassemble the whole web with this. So it isn't just social media. You can reassemble any type of feed, any type of search, any type of coordinated thing. And what we do is we use these keys in combination with a graph. And so anybody can take the data within these people's repositories or the endpoints where they're storing their data. And within that is a set of data that's called tags. And so people can tag any arbitrary text to any other key or any URL. And so this creates a graph of keys and URLs connected by subjective words. And this basically replaces centralized algorithms. It allows you to create the algorithm by taking a specific view on the graph. And so you can configure the graph or the query on the graph to give you back a view that could be anything. It could be all of the keys that follow me back that also have tagged something as golf in the past week. And that could be a feed that you create, not just a search. It'd be something that's constantly updated. And you can do that. Now you can imagine applying the same concepts to filtering a marketplace or filtering, anything, people you want to coordinate a coin join with, people you want to buy and sell, people you want to talk to, people you want to review, people you want to compete with. It's just a way of digitizing what actually happens, in my opinion, in the real world. The concepts of evolution, competition, cooperation, all these really primitive things that happen in society. It just tries to take those and digitize those and put the end user in control of how it looks at the system. And so what we've released is that protocol. We call it PubKey Core protocol. And that includes all of the requirements. So the ability to have that public key domain, to have a server that supports that idea, to have an indexer that creates that graph. And we've also created a first application that demonstrates this. the application looks at the moment very much like a social media website. It's called pubkey.app. And we're in beta with that now, hoping to come out of beta with that in January, February. But that is just the first phase of it. In other words, you can't do any of the things you would do in a network or any, you know, multi-user website or a software paradigm without those basic things installed. And so we've had those basic things going, and we're trying to move on from there. The next stage for that will be to introduce actual e-commerce capabilities. So users will be able to sell things to each other in the same individual way, where a marketplace could be assembled at will by any individual or any indexer. Um, and so that's where we're going with the Pubkey stuff. We've also had the BitKit mobile wallet for a while, which is self-custodial Bitcoin and Lightning wallet. That's still going fine. As we progress with the Pubkey stuff, we'll start integrating more of that into the BitKit wallet. But we also have Pubkey Ring, which is like a keychain or a wallet for identity keys. That's a mobile app as well, which you can use to sign into any Pubkey app. The reason why that's interesting is that this is a distinct difference from other peer-to-peer protocols, like Nostr, for example, where you have to keep the key hot. And so thus the security model is flawed from the start. In Pubkey, you could actually keep your identity keys cold while still using the system normally in as many applications as you want to. Beyond that, we have a lot of other side projects. You may recall that I released BIP 177 earlier this year, which was a way to redenominate Bitcoin and user experiences. I have more BIPs I'm working on.
I'm a fan. I've been signaling for BIP 177.
I think it's inevitable. I know that there's some, attachment to Sats and Satoshis. It doesn't say, I can't make people say.
Can we go back to the
certain
Pubkey
things.
thing? I just want for the folks at home to understand. So we talk about the failure of Bitcoin to scale. Like, how can you put Pubkey in that context for people so they understand, what you're doing? Because it sounds, I always think it's really eloquent when you spell it out. You create this new network of keys and relationships. How do you think that relates back to Bitcoin? And then I guess how do you square those two things together?
Well, I'll give you an example, and I'll mention another thing we're building that I haven't yet, which maybe helps put it together. In Bitcoin, for example, that method I described of using a public key for defining endpoints and the user being in control of it, there's a lot of applications for that in Bitcoin itself, like a Bitcoin node itself. For example, when you first load Bitcoin, there is actually hard-coded seeders in there. And those are just trusted websites that are meant to connect you to the network initially. Well, you could add the actual method's called PKARR, PKARR, public key addressable resource records, where you could basically add this concept to a Bitcoin node where it could now have public keys that now have a variable endpoint behind them. And so now the public keys can always be dynamic and more censorship resistant. And now you can compare the results in your node. You can say, okay, the public key result returns these nodes. The trusted result returns those nodes. And you can make sure everything's okay. And this is just a small way that you could improve and make Bitcoin itself less trusted. Or, for example, another thing we're working on, not the credit thing, but is something called PayKit, which is you could make an entire payment protocol that's abstracted to public keys. So instead of using, say, the Lightning Invoice protocol or the normal Bitcoin BIP21, QR code method, you could make a superficial method on top of them that manages things just from the Pubkey level. And then the user can have variable payment endpoints. So basically imagine you have one wallet that has Bitcoin, Lightning with Bolt 12, and Lightning with Bolt 13, and Lightning with Bolt 11, whatever, right? And the other one has Bitcoin and Bolt 12, but the Bolt 12 balance is empty. Well, they can both, one of them can give a QR code to the other one. They can scan it and they can learn all of that in the background and just automatically pay on chain because that's the only common payment method. And so you can now have a much, much better user experience for Bitcoin payments because we already have multiple payment protocols that are totally incompatible. Multiple on-chain ones, we have SegWit addresses, legacy addresses, where you have Taproot addresses. And then you have the same thing happening at every layer where they all have proprietary payment protocols. And so at some point, people are going to figure out, hey, this would be a lot easier if we didn't keep changing and adding more payment protocols. Let's just make it something that's higher level. And so that's another thing that we're working on and this would heavily improve Bitcoin and make it more extensible for all the payment protocols we'll create in the future. So you can just see again how
Maybe classic, like Bitcoin upgrades in the past as like a failure to create a unified payment protocol. Is that kind of like your view on the history of developments there?
sort of, I would say that our focus on complexity denies us all of the things we could be improving that don't require consensus changes. Like there's a lot, like Bitcoin 77 is just a simple example. It's totally aesthetic, right? But there are a lot of things that approach more complexity, but are still totally aesthetic. In other words, not consensus affecting, like the ones I just described. Those two changes could be added to Bitcoin, and it would affect nothing in a harmful way for anyone. It would only be a strict improvement, and there would be no controversy to it. Like there's just no harm to it. Now, the final thing that you wanted me to kind of tie this all together is the actual credit protocol idea. And so taking those trust concepts, these public key concepts, and now how do you apply this to an actual credit system where you're expressing those four properties that I mentioned? That's another area of research that we're working on.
Well, it's sort of like what makes PubKey Bitcoin, right? Like, so the argument for Lightning for a long
Nothing.
time.
It's not a Bitcoin tech at all. It's
Yeah.
just the relationship to Bitcoin is just convenience. In other words, one, it's an area for most people. It's an area we all derive from. All of our big ideas come from the big ideas that inspired us through Bitcoin, right? And so we're all trying to come from that direction. But PubKey isn't Bitcoin tech. Nothing that we innovate or that we make that is novel is Bitcoin tech specifically. It's just taking the tech, the primitives that we've discovered in our own research, and now applying them to Bitcoin, among other things. When I say that, like the credit protocol we're working on, the code name is Atomistic. I don't know if that's what will end up being called in the end, and we're working on that. But that could scale Bitcoin through scaling trust, but it could also scale Ethereum. It could also scale bananas. It could also scale, cigarettes. It doesn't matter because what it does is coordinate people with and match people with the things they're trying to do.
Right. I think this is where people get tripped up. It's sort of like, well, so do you think the community should be focused on scaling Bitcoin? And if they're not, so like, so you see a future where maybe, let's just say Pub plays out and PubKey and, sort of the payment protocol, on top of it becomes widely used. So that scales Bitcoin and kind of the user relationships that you want, or it doesn't?
Well, it scales trust is what it does. And so, in other words, again, going back to the beginning, what we all have to just accept is Bitcoin literally does not scale. There is no scale on the table. It's just gone. It's just not a thing. Stop. And so blockchains do not scale because of their design, and they can't scale. And if they did, the design wouldn't work. And so they just stop with the scaling. What you want to scale is trust. You want to scale the ability for people to coordinate using trust. The Bitcoin part doesn't matter. Now, once you scale all that, you can go and say, oh, let's apply this to Bitcoin. And let's use Bitcoin as the backing of credit. And let's use punishment contracts and things like Lightning does. You can add all that on after to the same system. But in the end, all you're trying to actually do is give people explicit ways to actually apply trust. And that's the part everybody's skipping. And the only reason I try to convince my peers or even inform my peers or persuade them is because I don't want to do it alone. I don't want to do everything because I know if I do, that I might fail just because of timing, being too slow, not having enough peers that care, not having a way to bootstrap. In other words, I could be wrong and still fail. And I don't like that. I want people to see what I see because I feel like if they did, they would feel embarrassed for the time that they're wasting. And they would feel interested in something new that it might actually be able to leverage themselves.
I think that's why you have to sort of get back to like connecting the ideas. So then the question sort of remains where it's like, why should the Bitcoin movement be concerned with, clearly the Bitcoin movement, I think, as ununified as it become is broadly concerned with this idea that more people should be using Bitcoin, right? I mean, that sort of defines sort of every sub community, whether it's like the Treasury folks who have their sort of view on it, so the kind of crypto L2/ordinals folks, even to the Lightning, maxi kind of homogenous, right? They're all sort of united still by this goal that we want more people using Bitcoin, and so is PubKey compatible with that goal?
Sure. In other words, if you want a lot of people using Bitcoin, this is your only chance, is to find somebody to scale it through trust. Because if you don't do it in a peer-to-peer way, in a way that an individual has control, then it will happen through banks. And so all we'll be doing is taking this awesome invention that was created and putting it back in the old system. And that's the trend we're on, right? Like more and more wallets are custodial, more and more people are using exchanges and exchange wallets, more and more treasuries. Most of the interest in liquidity that was put into Bitcoin this year and the past 2 years was put in through treasury stocks, not directly into Bitcoin. And so we're creating this system where scale means trust anyway, right? Like we're already scaling through trust, except we're just choosing to do it the old way. We're choosing to do it through 10 people instead of, through each other. And I'm just saying there are actually ways we could do it through each other instead of those, instead of just Michael Saylor and whoever else. So yeah, I'm just trying to get people to look at it differently so they can see there is another path where we don't have to like support Michael Saylor. We can just say this is basically no different, indistinguishable from a Ponzi scheme. The people inside are just all just trying to get rich and don't care about Bitcoin at all. And so why don't we just say fuck them and let's figure out what to do without them and stop being thankful and inviting these people to conferences.
Well, so I got to ask because I knew this was going to add another 20 minutes discussion, but I can't. I got to take it on this one. So the Bitcoin Treasury Company movement, broadly is sort of predicated at this point on this idea that you can scale Bitcoin through using Wall Street based trust relationships and the sort of securities and the legal structure that has grown up around that. So it sounds like you don't agree that will work in practice, or what's maybe you can define your objection there a bit more granularly, because they're sort of saying their argument would be like, self custody is not going to scale. We need to get more people exposed to Bitcoin. People are buying these financial products. We could recreate these financial products, in a more Bitcoin native way. You don't like any of that.
You can certainly see how some of it overlaps, right? I'm saying that we have to apply trust as well. They're saying that we can't scale Bitcoin without banks, which is essentially centralized forms of trust. They also say we can't do it without hubs like LSPs on Lightning or Arc, or ARCs in Arc. So there is an agreement there underneath, which is that we all want people to use Bitcoin as much as possible. We all, whether we want to admit it or not, behave in ways that would support us getting rich if they do. In other words, we don't want to inflate the quantity of Bitcoin. We don't want to raise the block size. We don't want to have multiple blockchains because that spreads our ability to get rich and removes it because of inflation and monetary inflation, things like this. But we do agree that Bitcoin can't scale underneath. So it's like when you ask the person one way, they'll say, well, obviously Bitcoin can't scale. That's why we need banks and why people use exchanges, why people use Wallet of Satoshi, and why people use treasuries, obviously, because they want to justify the getting rich part. But then when you come in from a different direction and you want to say to them, wait, you just said that Bitcoin doesn't scale, but now you say Lightning is the next Visa. Which one is it? You know what I mean? Is it that we need banks and banks are a form of scaling Bitcoin and a part of its future? Or is it that we can scale it through layers and those things aren't banks too? Well, they're banks too, okay? And that's what's actually happening is it's all banks.
It sounds like there's a lot of commonality, right? Because there's an agreement from that group that, again, like whatever you think, the traditional financial infrastructure exists, right? And it has grown up and there are certain protections around it that some people like more than the crypto system, right? Which almost totally lacks these types of protections. So what do you think the future of the Treasury Company movement what can they achieve just by getting banks and financial institutions activated? Can they achieve anything useful for the movement in your view?
Depends on the movement and your definition of it, but I would say no, not really. I think it's pretty clear that Michael Saylor's ability to pump Bitcoin is not very strong. You know what I mean? That Treasury's ability to pump the Bitcoin price itself doesn't seem to be very strong, at least so far. We could have easily mistaken any effect that, the price going up on Michael Saylor in previous times when it wasn't him, potentially. Could have just been other things.
He's doing right now with like his version of digital credit is right. These financial products that he's releasing where essentially, they'll pay a dividend or some sort of yield, right? And so there are a lot of buyers in the
It's not digital credit. It's just leverage, right? He's just trying to create more risk profiles for people. He's just trying to create more products for people to create more exposure to his scheme. And in the end, what his scheme actually is buying Bitcoin at market price and reselling it at above market price as shares. And so what happens is his users get locked in at a higher cost basis into the shares, but their hope is that the multiple of the Bitcoin represented will increase, the MNAV, et cetera. But the problem is that that's not actually like any sort of net impact on the price because he's buying at market price. He's overselling it to the people, and all the liquidity is going to him instead of real Bitcoin. And so you've seen that this results in a relatively flat price effect. Now, I'm speculating. I don't really know. The market's too complicated for me to be confident in what I'm saying, but it's interesting to think about, right? And so at first, I haven't researched how Saylor speaks about credit, but when I saw that he does do that, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to have to look into that. But if he's doing it in the way that you mentioned, which is, oh, when he speaks about credit, what he's talking about is other, security products. No, that obviously you can see how that's very different than what I'm trying to describe with peer to peer.
His analogy is he's selling Bitcoin's appreciation over time out in tranches, right? So his view is that, and again, like I think if there's a foundational sort of plane on which to quibble, it's this idea that Bitcoin has a growth rate that is consistent or can be modeled. And then from that growth rate, that exposure can be parceled out into different financial products, right? So he has a series of tranches and they're all, payout different schemes. So I don't know.
How is this any different than Plan B's model? You know what I mean? It's just trying to say that you can predict the future. You can't, right? Bitcoin could stay under $125,000 for 10 more years.
Well, the thing that he has to do is he has to meet the payments that he's promising as a result of these financial terms, right? So
which means eventually he has to sell the underlying to meet it.
Well, I mean, his claim is that it is the appreciation of the assets that he's selling, right? So, and then he's reselling that.
It's not literally a Ponzi scheme, but it has the same function, right? It only can keep the price and keep going up for as long as he keeps adding more Bitcoin to it. As long as there's new liquidity, it can support the price. But as soon as people don't believe that MNAV is going to go up or that, his ability to borrow has now been, diminished, as soon as people think that, it's over. You know what I mean? Because they're all there for the profit. They're not there for Bitcoin or utility or censorship resistance or whatever. They're there for multiples of gains. You know what I mean? And people, in my opinion, are going to be if we topped for this cycle, what do you think is going to happen in the next, 2 years? Do you think that it's just going to stay at 90K? No. All the people that in Master that are bored, all the treasury owners that are bored, they're going to sell it because they're going to say, oh, I missed out on NVIDIA. I missed out on that. They're just going to move to something else that's better speculation. You can't fix Bitcoin with, just pure speculation. When I talk about credit, it's not using Bitcoin as collateral. Yeah, sure. If you want to have credit based on collateral, you can, but you don't need collateral for credit. You have an obligation. The obligation can come from your income, your revenue. It can come from trust. It can never be settled. You can stay in this, lightning channel forever, right? And so if you never settle, where's the collateral? Where's the need for it? And so I have an interest in, are we denying ourselves an even more interesting future where maybe if we actually figure out peer-to-peer credit, we realize that collateral and money are way less important than we thought they were because all we were trying to coordinate the entire time was trust ever since cavemen. You know what I mean? It was always just trying to find a way to trust because you want to go and all I had is bananas and you don't want bananas. So will you please take the bananas for now as a proxy? You know what I mean? It's just a bartering tool. And maybe there's a way to redefine what money even is if we give people a tool that lets them, actually apply trust explicitly.
John, I'm not sure where to go with this. We're at an hour, winding down a little bit. I covered a lot of topics. Maybe I just get quickly as we kind of wind down, little scope of what you're working on and going to release over the next few months. And then, I got to be careful because I don't want to open up a whole another can of worms. But maybe we can end on talking about this idea of the Bitcoin. I feel like a lot of the Bitcoin culture is centered around the Bitcoin price. And, we just had talked a little bit about some of the, there isn't this continued appreciation. A lot of the aspects of the movement, might be affected by that. So, how do you think about the price of Bitcoin? and the fact that the culture is so invested in this at this point and is assured by this. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I always thought that orange pilling and number go up were immoral concepts. I don't think these are not things that I support. I don't like the idea of like me convincing someone to buy Bitcoin and then buying at the top and then panic selling at the bottom and me being responsible for that. You have to figure out your own risks and things like this. So it's not. I think it's a sin, for lack of a better word. I'm not very religious, but just the idea that like it's that somehow if you keep being a good Bitcoiner and keep convincing everybody else to be a good Bitcoiner, that Bitcoin will make you rich and that's some sort of like magical phenomenon. No, it's just if other people provide liquidity and buy your Bitcoin at a higher price, you will benefit more than them. And if that dynamic starts becoming smaller, which it appears that it might be, in other words, if we don't get like a 10x every cycle, then the people that bought in for that, whether they realize it or not, will go away. They don't have the patience. When if the people want high risk, high reward, and Bitcoin doesn't give it to them, they'll leave. If that's why they buy Bitcoin. If people buy Bitcoin because they want to be able to buy, drugs on the black market, they don't care, right? They think, "Oh shit, I can buy less drugs now. Oh shit, I can buy more drugs now." That's all they care about, right? And so it's not like it's not the same situation. So I think that, yeah, I think that is a little bit like poisoning the well to always have all these memes be so idolized in our culture. They become
So, that,
like these
so
little.
what are you using Bitcoin for at present, and like why is Bitcoin your primary sort of financial technology or save? I don't know. Again, I it's hard to express these without falling into prior traps. You can go into like savings technology or financial asset. I assume that you are using Bitcoin more
I
than
don't use that
dollars.
much differently than anybody else. Yeah, it's not that I'm some sort of like I'm blessed guy and I'm the guy who knows how to use Bitcoin in the purest way. No, I have all the same inclinations as everybody else. I also want to sell my Bitcoin for more than I paid for it. I also, want to see as many people exposed to it as possible, largely for that reason, but also because I want it to be legitimate. I want it to be ubiquitous. I don't trust banks. I don't want my money to be where somebody else can take it, my life savings. I want it to be somewhere where I can protect it, where I can hide it, where I can choose what happens to it and how to protect it. And so I do care about Bitcoin in the self custodial aspect and in the censorship aspect. And so I would just say, judge me by my actions, not by my intent or my morals. My actions are that last bear market, I decided that this bull market, that during this specific year, I would spend all year selling enough Bitcoin to pay for a down payment on a house. I believe that your savings are saving for something. You're either saving to make sure you have enough to cover a medical emergency, enough for college for your kids, for a car, for a house, whatever. And if you're not doing that with your Bitcoin, all you're doing is purely speculating. You know what I mean? You're just trading. You're just part of the Ponzi. But if you have a plan and something you're saving for, and you reach that plan and you execute that plan, like I did this year, you have no regrets. You said, "Oh, I did the thing. I completed my mission," and it's only coincidence and luck that I finished selling, before Bitcoin started dumping recently. And my plan is done. Next week, I'm going to go to the US. I'm going to look at houses and I'm going to buy one. I'm going to use a mortgage because I still want to hold, whatever Bitcoin I have left. But I did sell enough for a down payment. And that's my plan. That's what I'm going to do. I've been telling everybody that's what I'm going to do. I tell my team that's what I was going to do. But I tell them also, don't trade. You can't have a life and trade at the same time. It's too stressful. It's a trap. Every time you win, it's a trap. People, you think you won because of skill, but it was just luck. And you'll keep playing until you lose, and the casino will always win. So just don't do that. But there's a line, right? There's a line between speculating on the future where you had a plan and you know what to do in the failure modes of that plan. And then there's pure speculation. So yeah, I will reassess things again. If we enter another bear market and the price is $50,000 or something, I will ask myself, what's my plan for when the price goes up again? You know, because I'm going to die someday. I'm not going to hold till I die. I think that Michael Saylor says you never sell your Bitcoin because he never wants you to sell his Bitcoin because he needs you to hodl so he can keep leveraging. But I think you sell your Bitcoin whenever the hell you want to. That's what it's for. So you can choose.
Always abstract in our discussion, sir. I know we could go for another hour, but I want to be conscious of your time and, of course, the listeners. PubKey and Synonym, where do they go?
Sure. So yeah, we'll be releasing the PubKey app publicly at the end of January while we're in El Salvador, as well as the new version of BitKit. If you want to try either of those applications, you can go to pubkey.app. And if you want to try it while it's in beta, you can contact me on social media and ask for an invite code, and I'll give it to you. BitKit itself is already in app stores and ready to use right now, self-custodial wallet. And then going into next year, we'll be releasing all the payment-related things that I mentioned. So PayKit, payment features in PubKey app, and then probably at least a white paper or such for the credit protocol. And our website is synonym.tl if you want to visit our website.
There you go. Go and check it out. While you're there, you go to blockworks.co. Check out all the great podcasts there. Of course, events coming up as well for the calendar next year. Once again, this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast. Thanks for tuning in.